if you have some food that you know your child isn't going to be able to eat, would they be able to tolerate it on their plate? Because we know exposure can really help the child learn how to be able to, begin to eat something like that they can begin to taste things. But if your child is super hungry, you want to give them a preferred food to begin with, and then maybe a food they're working on. And I like giving these labels to foods of like, this is something that's safe, this is something you're working on, and this is something that would be like a goal food. Like this is all gonna happen in time with support.
Before we start, I want to address the fact that I know how overwhelming it can feel to parent a child with ADHD. That's why I want to share my journey with you through my book, How We Roll, A Parent's Journey on Raising a Child with ADHD. All my experiences, insights are narrowed down into this book. To help you get started, I've made the first 3 chapters of the book available to you for free. You can check out through the link in the show notes. Hi, ladies. I'm looking forward to talking to you today. Today, my very special guest is Judy Delaware, who is a pediatric occupational therapist, a feeding specialist, co-founder of feedinglittles.com. She is also co-author of 2 bestseller books, one called Feeding Littles and Beyond, and another one called Feeding Littles Lunches. She is also a breastfeeding and lactation counselor. We are very lucky to have her join us today. And then my other guest is my friend and Judy's friend, Julie Abrams, who is also an occupational therapist and an ADHD parent coach. So let's get into it. This all started from a listener who wrote in. This episode is dedicated to Matt, who wrote in and wanted to get more information about how to help his child, who is a picky eater, and he's having some conflict around food with his child and wanted more support. So here we are to talk about it and get more insight.
Hi, Kate.
Hi, Judy. Hi, Julie.
Hi. Great to be with you guys today.
Yeah. Okay, so let's just start with a very basic question. What is a picky eater?
So a picky eater is typically a child who is got a limited amount of food, but maybe around 30 foods. They might have a limited volume and be a slow eater, and they might prefer to drink more than eat solids. They'll have very strong preferences maybe towards beige food, more crunchy, and perhaps fruits, and be a little reluctant to try new foods when they're hungry.
Okay, so that's a picky eater. Okay, and so this is on this podcast, we talk primarily about ADHD and the neurodiversity that comes with that. So how common is it for neurodiverse kids to struggle with picky eating? And is that always do they always go hand in hand?
So typically we see when kids first begin to eat, picky eating can commonly take place on the developmental continuum. And we might see some kids who start to have some picky habits and they will outgrow them. Other kids, and we know somewhere between a third to a half of them, will actually turn into having more problems with feeding, and they might actually have some persistent feeding problems down the road. And a lot of it has to do with it's really a combination of how they're eating, and can it be traumatic from a primary diagnosis, oral motor problems, swallowing issues, or sensory issues regarding that kind of food. So it is kind of a common thing that parents see with children, but it's something that can begin to develop and become more selective as they grow, that we become more concerned about.
Okay, so is this something where early intervention can play a critical role?
Yes, and as what I do in my job is as a OT and early intervention, I go to people's homes and kids' daycares, and I work with families, and it's really about the communication between the families, the daycare people, and the child about tell me what your child has been eating. So many times if they've already started eating and they've got some selectiveness in what they're eating, I want to know how is it going? Who do they eat with? Sometimes I ask the question, do the parents even eat with the kids? Many times parents will say, I want them to eat, and here we go, broccoli, poor broccoli, because broccoli always gets a bad name. And parents will say, I want them to eat meats and more vegetables. And, just I want them to eat what I'm cooking for dinner. That would probably be the biggest, most broadest stroke I hear from parents all the time. I don't want to be a short order cook. I want them to eat whatever I'm fixing. But I also ask the question, how often do your children see you eat? And many times I'm very surprised to find out how little exposure children have to seeing their adult members of their family actually eating. It's because of schedules, it's because of drop off, who comes home what time. And so there's a lot of busyness in our schedules now. So that's one thing that I will ask, but absolutely early intervention can and does play a very big role in feeding with children under the age of 3.
Okay. And so do parents influence what a child their eating habits by just simply watching their parents eat?
Well, 2 things. Think about when your child is learning to stand and, when they start to walk around, they're toddling around the house, they are imitating us at all times. They want to grab the broom, they want to get to the counter, of course, they want the remote, now they want the phone, and they are always watching. And of course, developmentally, that's what they're supposed to be doing. They're learning, they're watching, they're absorbing. And back to your question, can adults and the parents and the family impact their children? And the answer is yes. And so much of it can also come from language and the language around what are you saying about your child? And maybe are you labeling your child as that they're having trouble? Are they a picky eater or things like, he won't eat that? And kids hear that. They might not be able to respond verbally to it, but they're hearing it and absorbing it and understanding what does that mean? How do I respond to that?
Very interesting.
I wanted to
Okay.
say one more thing too. As Judy, you were talking about the factors that play into picky eating. And I think for parents of kids with ADHD, another piece of it, in addition to the sensory piece, is sometimes that rigid thinking, the lack of flexibility, and they can sometimes get stuck with, I'll eat McDonald's chicken nuggets, but I will not eat the kind that you buy at the store. Certain rigidities tend to come into play, and I think that parents of kids with ADHD can tend to relate to those, given that lots of times you wanna get control of your life, so that's something that kids can tend to control.
And with that rigidity, parents sometimes feel it's easier to feed them a sure thing than attempt to do the other brands that you just like. That's a perfect example of they'll do one brand of food. And my job is to help them branch out and not have some of those feeding selectivities of one kind of food. So great point, Julie.
Yeah. And so here's the question. Will your child, it plays into this fear, right? That the child's going to starve to death in this standoff between the child and the parent, right? So how does the parent navigate the standoff of like, I'm not going to eat unless it's this versus,
And
a diverse diet?
And the hardest time to get into a battle is when you're in the middle of the battle with a child, when they're hungry. You're never going to be able to negotiate, I want you to eat this new food when you're already dealing with a child who who literally fears the food, that there is trauma, there is anxiety, there is all of that feeling of like, that is not a safe food for me and I don't want to go there. So there's wonderful feeding techniques that we utilize and help the families be able to see how they can broaden the foods and create more variety in textures and tastes and flavors for the child.
Yeah. Okay.
If your child is having what Judy just described, then it would be good to contact an OT or someone who specializes in feeding, because having an expert walk you through some of those techniques can really lighten your burden, because like you said, there's so much that you're doing as a parent that it can be very overwhelming. Because I think it's sometimes hard, like picky eating. Well, when does it really become a problem where you need an expert?
Yeah. And so that was what I was going to ask. Like, what's like developmentally appropriate picky eating? And then when is it not?
I started out by explaining what picky eating might look like, and maybe it'll help if I describe what selective eating can become. So, selective eating is actually a diagnosis of a feeding disorder. And when a child has selective eating, what it's described as, it's first of all, it's a lot more concerning and it's a lot more restrictive. And it looks like that the child might only eat 10 foods as opposed to 30, which is very restrictive, and they're very brand sensitive. They will not eat when they're hungry, and they will have other types of trauma that may have caused their feeding issues to happen.
Okay. What are those other traumas?
And that trauma can be a variety of things that happen at birth. We can have children who maybe they were born premature, they've had some kind of cardiology or respiratory issue. Children that have had very severe RSV. I have seen kids who wound up having, to be on other kind of medical devices to keep them healthy. And then all of a sudden they develop respiratory issues and they're on new medications. So some of those medications might make them feel not great and maybe even take their appetites away. So those are some of those traumatic medical things that do happen to children. And then the other things can also be they might have some oral motor issues that literally prevent their mouth from working properly from early on. And because I work with kids and moms from the very beginning where they're breastfeeding, one of the questions I ask is, if I've just met you, tell me about your breastfeeding or bottle feeding history with your child. And many times it is a dotted line that the baby had a really hard time breastfeeding. They struggled with bottle feeding. It was never easy. And that dotted line takes us to what they look like when they're maybe 18 months or 2 years old, that all of a sudden, it's not all of a sudden, it's been there all along and we're just uncovering it and really looking at the path of what feeding has looked like kind of from day one.
Yeah. Okay.
And the other piece can also include swallowing issues. And many children have issues where they can't swallow thicker or thinner consistencies. So many times they might need a bottle that has some type of a medical thickener into it that helps that child be able to swallow better. So in the long run, thinner things are harder to swallow. Thicker things are a little easier to swallow for children that have maybe an aspiration risk. So those are things that I would consider traumatic in their feeding history as well.
Okay.
Can I piggyback off of something that you said, Judy, was the medications? And I think, again, for kids with ADHD who are on a stimulant medication, one of the biggest side effects is decreased appetite. So, them not having an appetite perhaps during the day or not eating lunch, and then they get home. And sometimes what happens is it's almost past that point of no return where they start to get really dysregulated and they're very hungry, but either don't recognize it or just are refusing to eat. And sometimes they're not even on the stimulant medication and they still have the same behavior.
Yeah, and if I could just address that, I think it takes a village to really pull this together. When we know about kids who are have maybe they go to school in the morning and maybe they didn't have a whole lot of breakfast. They go to lunch and perhaps they didn't really eat a lot. The lunchroom was too overstimulating for them, or they chose to eat some things that maybe were crunchy, that maybe it was fruit, maybe they did eat. It's the quality of what they ate and how long that's going to hold them over. So, kids need to eat pretty frequently, and we have to look at, the caloric density. So, like, for example, like what's fat content of what they ate? If they ate a bag of veggie straws and a bag of grapes, that probably holds them, for 20 minutes. And then parents' pickup time happens, and that child is long past hungry. They're long past hungry. And what happens then is they don't really know how to respond. And I mean, it does take a village to be able to pull that together and asking parents, how can that help? How can the school help? What can be done during snack time to, make certain somebody's paying attention? Did my child really eat, their cheese, or whatever it is that we have in their lunchbox? So I don't know if that kind of addresses what you're thinking, but I think it's important to talk about.
Yeah. And I think, Judy, what you said, it takes a village. It's kind of like if they do eat like that, which I think is a typical scenario for an ADHD kid, it's the caregiver or the parent showing up right after school with like a big fat protein snack, right? And just trying to get them kind of back, get their insulin levels and all of that back on track before you even go one step further.
Well, and I think the big picture too, Kate, is we have to look at our lives. A lot of times kids will get in the car and where are you going? You have something else to get to. You're in a hurry to be able to get to that, so our lives and the pressure of we don't just have this luxury time to just like sit and eat and just take the time, you know, many things that Julie's describing about a child who's dysregulated, they might need to run around. They might need to do some kind of a resistive activity, which will bring them to a point of wanting to be able to eat.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in general, I hear a lot of parents say, articulate a lot of concern around their kid not eating lunch. And I think it's all parents. So I want to let them know that in general, kids have a hard time eating lunch at school. There's so many factors. If you're getting hot lunch, you have to wait in line. It's a huge social time. So if you have lunch before you have recess, then you're rushing because you just want to get outside and play with your friends. Or if you're at the back of the line for the hot lunch, then maybe they run out or they run out of the thing that you wanted. So there's just so many factors. So again, really thinking about what they're having for breakfast and if that can hold them, and then a really solid snack at the end of the day, because you're not alone if your kid doesn't eat lunch or much lunch at school.
And I mean, we could talk about this. This could be a podcast all on its own.
Okay.
I mean, I walk into daycares and parents just think they have a full hour for lunch. And I'm like, oh, that does not happen. I mean, they put the food down and granted, we do kind of a pre and a during and a post period during lunchtime, but kids are so distracted and a lot of things can disrupt their ability to eat. And sometimes, like what Julie was just saying, somebody even standing in line and somebody brushing them or, accidentally pushing against them while they're standing in line. Maybe they were hungry, but now they became dysregulated just standing in line. So which is the loudest of the screams? My stomach is hungry or I can't really focus right now because I feel so agitated.
Yeah. Okay. So when does a parent, like if your child there's one thing where they're not eating when they're supposed to, which can lead to, dysregulation. And then there's kids who are really kind of like just not into eating.
Right.
And so when should parents like be concerned that their kids are kind of becoming malnutrition or getting they're having deficiency in nutrition? Like, how do you navigate that as your kid? Let's say you only have one kid, or it's your oldest kid, or all your other kids are eating. And this one kid, you're just worried about them and trying to figure out like when you ring the alarm and when you don't.
Well, the good news is there is a lot of information for parents. There's screening tools. I'll give you this that you can have at the very end that you can pop on here. But if you're noticing that your child has been eating foods and is starting to lose foods, that maybe they were really selective, but they went from, let's say they were eating at least 30 foods, but all of a sudden you're like, I actually started to pay attention. Now they're only eating 20 and they've gotten down maybe below 20. That is definitely something that would be concerning, that would make me say, I would want to reach out and get some help. And the first place I would say is talk to your pediatrician. Your pediatrician typically is a really, really good resource for getting some help for you. If it's the 0 to 3 program, early intervention is there. If your child is over 3 and you need help, there's programs, there's feeding therapists in most communities. And there's something called feedingmatters.org that has a beautiful website. There is a screening tool that parents can fill out. There is a list of feeding therapists by zip code, which is super easy to be able to find someone. And then they also have a wonderful path for support systems for parents as well. And just giving it a name, knowing what it is, I think is so valuable. Something that I always tell parents, I walk in and I see kids, many times they've just come home from the hospital and they're, from being bored and they're already struggling with feeding. And something that I have noticed in my practice over many, many, many years is that if a child needs a physical therapist because the kid's not sitting or rolling or beginning to crawl, that seems doable for parents to know my child needs help with physical limitations. But when they meet someone like myself, because their child's not eating, it feels like a failure, especially for the mom. I can't breastfeed my kid. The stress that trauma causes a parent is just unimaginable. And I think that difference between those two scenarios is parents feel helpless. And then they're bombarded with social media ideas of you should be doing this, you should be doing baby-led weaning, you should be doing these, your child should be eating all these things. And this bombardment from social media, I think that in itself is traumatizing to all of us. And it's like, as a parent, what do you listen to?
Yeah.
Where do I stand in all this?
Yeah, that for sure is overwhelming.
Yeah.
One thing I liked that I suggest to parents too, if they're curious, is just to write down a 3-day food log. And so just write down everything the child eats, when they're eating, how much they're eating, because then you can take a look and get an idea of how much, do they have 20 foods in that time? Are they eating the same thing over and over? And it just kind of gives a starting place. And then as a therapist too, I like to look at it and see, is it a well-rounded meal? Is it all crunchy foods? Is it just
Like beige, like
Yeah,
a lot of beige. Beige. And when I say that, parents are like, what? I'm like, think about when you were pregnant in your first trimester. Think of all the things if you didn't feel so good so much, what did you eat? You ate rice and pastas and crackers and breads and toasts. And parents are like, yep, those are the beige foods.
Yeah.
And they're because they
And kids love beige foods.
well, and think about why we love beige food. We did a post at Feeding Littles of blueberry, 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 Ritz cracker, Ritz cracker, Ritz cracker. And every blueberry is going to taste different. Every Ritz cracker is always going to be the same. So consistency, guaranteed. It's a sure thing. That cracker, when I open it, is going to taste just like the one I had last time. So it's about trust. And if kids can't trust, like think about it. Like think blueberries, blackberries, fruit in general is not always the same. They look the same. Oh, no, they don't look the same. Sometimes they're big, sometimes they're little. One's squishy, one's sour, one's like, oh, I should have thrown that one away. And kids learn. They learn quickly. Two of those that don't taste good, I'll go to the Ritz
Cracker.
every time.
Okay, so Judy, tell us about the food battle. Like, how do parents, let's talk about dinner time with the picky eater, this battle, the ADHD kid who only wants his beige food. How do parents kind of navigate dinner time to not give in? It's always it can be a power struggle. How do they not give in to cooking a side meal so they eat?
And this starts really early in life. But when parents realize I've made something and we the adults are going to eat it, but we're going to give the other something else to the baby. So habits actually start pretty young when you start feeding your child. And if I have the luxury of talking to those parents first, what I would say is you could do something as simple as deconstruct. Let's say you made beef stew. And you're like, well, I don't think they can chew the meat. So you can deconstruct it and put the potatoes and the green beans and the carrots or something like that separately on the child's plate. But they begin to see that the food is the same. Now, and then of course, the big thing for me is kids eating with the family. They see it, they smell it, they see you eating it. Those are huge predictors on whether or not our child is going to eat down the road. Now, for kids who have already created some of these habits around how we eat, what's happening, my first thought is keeping things as neutral as possible. Keeping things calm, and I know that's really hard because as soon as we get into the battle, as soon as the food goes down, we hear language. And we know what we hear. Yuck, I'm not going to eat that. They'll throw it across the table. And so it's the beginning of how can we let's even start like at a 3-year-old level. What can we get that child to do to take ownership in that meal to begin with? When I ask parents, can you get your child to do something in the kitchen to prepare them for a meal? And that could be as simple as if they can reach the table, can they bring a napkin? Can they bring even an empty cup, plates, silverware to the table? Buying in and having ownership to begin with will help the idea of that child being part of the meal time. And giving them opportunities during the meal of what are we talking about. The first thing I tell parents is, could we not talk about food? If the three of us right now were having a meal together, we would order and eat, and I might say, how's your club sandwich or whatever you're having, but I wouldn't look at how many bites you're taking. And sometimes parents get into minutia and this control level with children. And kids are hearing, I'm not a good eater. I'm not a good eater. I need to be eating more. Those messages are strong. So feeding and eating and being together is a very comprehensive, activity of daily living. So for example, if you have some food that your child isn't going to be able to eat, would they be able to tolerate it on their plate? Because we know exposure can really help the child learn how to be able to, begin to eat something like that they can begin to taste things. But if your child is super hungry, you want to give them a preferred food to begin with, and then maybe a food they're working on. And I like giving these labels to foods of like, this is something that's safe. This is something you're working on. And this is something that would be like a goal food, like this is all going to happen in time with support. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, and then I have heard of whoops, go ahead.
Okay, I just have one follow-up question because I get this one a lot too that I think is a slippery slope. So if you don't want to answer it, that's fine. But a lot of parents will say, my kid has a really hard time sitting at the table and eating with us. But if I put them in front of the TV or a tablet, they'll eat whatever is in front of them.
Right. And I think that that is a super valid point. And so let's break it down. As occupational therapists, we do something that, we look at the activity and go, well, why is that? Maybe there's no pressure. I mean, think about it to begin with. There's no pressure and the child can really focus on what they're doing. And if a child is eating that way, how did we get to that point to begin with? And the goal is, how can we turn that screen or show into maybe a book being read or a game that's being played at the table that has nothing at all to do with feeding? I like to use like a mason jar like this, and I like to fill it with ideas that kids can talk about during a meal. And the focus, just think about, let's say they love dinosaurs or trucks, and you just like for a little fortune cookie or a little post-it note inside, and every one of those little ideas is something that the child, if they're old enough to be able to discuss something, can bring out. And when the focus is not on them, it's so much easier for them to feel regulated. That pressure of eating from adults can actually sabotage what we're trying to do with our kids. So I mean, we got to keep an eye on the prize, and the prize is, what's your goal? What do you want your child to look like when they're 10, 12, 14, 16, whatever? What are you looking for? So, we have to begin wherever they are and also understand, what are the parents' goals? I mean, sometimes parents say, I'm totally fine if they eat in front of the TV, or that's what we do as a family. And if that's what we do as a family, we start there.
Yeah.
And the more we learn about it, the more we have to ask that question, what are you guys okay with that? What happens when you go out or they're with friends or they're at school and they can't watch a screen?
Great answer.
And I like, Judy, how you suggested like a game, some kind of novelty to bring that which helps ADHD kids, right? If you keep it a little interesting and there's something there for them to look forward to, that helps everything, even if that's to the dinner table. I like that idea.
And it's always, and it can be interesting and fun. And I just, as an OT, I love getting kids involved. And whether it's they're just beginning to learn to do some things in the kitchen, what the learning tower is, one of those towers that kids can stand on that has like 4 sides, and they can be at the counter. And I love any kind of integration where kids are, helping dump into a bowl or, pouring something. Any piece of that can be, again, a step going towards them helping in the kitchen. And that step towards doing more in the kitchen can lead to them eating more food.
Yeah. And it builds executive functioning skills.
Absolutely. And steps.
Organizing, yes, all the steps in a much more fun way.
It's like a tip I like to give parents is that, they're like, well, how do I introduce something new? And one of my favorite things to be able to do is, you don't want to introduce something new when they're hangry, when they're in the worst possible situation. A fun activity that I love to do is ask parents if they have a muffin tin at home. And in that muffin tin, this is an activity to do away from feeding. And you could put different tastes, different flavors. So you could open your condiments, you could put ketchup and mustard and all the things, all the dressings, and you just put a little dot of that into the muffin tin. And the idea is they're just going to learn to just taste it. And the only thing they can use is descriptive words. They can't say things like yuck or I don't like it. And it only could be just like a pinky full of food. And they could say whether they thought it was like spicy or sour, and begin to work on that language descriptors for them to be able to expand their language about how they're feeling about that food, what they interpret that food to feel like in their mouth. And that game is great, especially if there's one kid who is kind of the pickiest of the eaters, and there's a couple of other young kids, because those young kids are like taking notes every meal.
Yeah.
Yes. So it's a fun game, and it's a fun it's a fun thing you can do to see what kids say. I mean, I've had the parents get blindfolded and the kids will say, "Okay, mom, what's this one?" See if they can even identify what it is.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's great for the parents to model too when they're eating, like, "Ooh, this is really salty," or, "I like how this is so smooth," so that they're modeling those characteristics of the food instead of focusing so much on their opinions.
Okay, I have a question for you, Judy, and Julie can answer too. So I have heard this, like if you have multiple kids in the family, right, and you're just trying to get through mealtime and you have the picky eater, which could be actually any of the kids, regardless if they had but in that moment, they just are not digging what dinner is. Is it okay to have a backup plan? So like this one, what I learned as a parent, she had 4 kids, right? And so the backup was if they didn't wanna eat, they could have a bowl of cereal. And those were the 2 options. That was it. Either you participate in the meal with what was served or you have the bowl of cereal. Those are your options and you're in or out.
And
Like, is that strategy work? Is that
I think the question, first of all, is this something that happens all the time, frequently, occasionally? Because it's okay. Especially like if it's an allergy or something like that, I'm okay. And there's just some days that kids are just like, I don't want it. And I think how we approach it, the approach is everything because, oh, you're not going to have it, but this is what the option is. And let's make the option not this like the best of the best of the best. You can have crackers and cheese and a banana, or so, make it so it's not this, like let's say a bar, like some of the bars that are out there that are really sweet and they're very
I
nutritious.
got it. Yeah, like a
They could be
nutrition. Yeah.
they can be super nutritionally dense, but they're just one thing. They're just one kind, and kids can kind of get stuck. And I think it's just a matter of if we get into this habit on a consistent basis and how the parents approach it and how we describe it to the parent to the child is what the child is going to hear. And again, if I think it's just all in how it's offered and when it's offered on a regular basis. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, that helps. It gives good guidance.
I think that if an alternative is available, then kids will hold out for the alternative and it might decrease their adventurous eating. Why would I eat this broccoli if I could hold out and have something more preferred instead? So sometimes that lends itself to a little bit more of the behavior cycle.
Of like a power, now it turns into this power struggle, right? So we have to be careful of what we're offering and how we offer it. I still think yes, and the idea would be, could it be on your tray? Could you even take one small bite of it to begin with, and see where that lends itself with what that child is going to eat. And I like having children, if they're old enough, be able to serve themselves. Like if you're able to serve things in a family style, having the plate be passed or scoop past them so that they have, I like using like the old fashioned Goldilocks, like a daddy spoon and a mommy spoon and a baby spoon, size wise, for serving so that they can say, like the easy out would be, I'll just take a baby spoonful as opposed to, a daddy spoonful. So kind of giving them some form of independence and control, like the old adage of my job is to provide, your job is to decide. And where does it go from there?
But if somebody's listening and their child is not little, like a toddler anymore, one, if their toddler is struggling, I think really at it where it's exasperating, they should go get help, right? From an occupational therapist. And you gave us like great resources to look into for that. And can somebody still get help for their child all the way through being a teenager if these struggles have been going on in these power dynamics? Is that possible?
Absolutely. And just to clarify, sometimes speech language pathologists are also feeding specialists. So it could be an occupational therapist or a speech therapist. I actually know a couple of physical therapists who are food coaches and teach food school as well. So it is never too late. Obviously, as habits grow, preferences become deeper habits, but it can always change. And the more knowledge a person will have as they get older about their sensory preferences, and it can turn into more of a social request, like, I want to fit in more. When my friends eat salad or when my friends eat sushi, I want to be able to do that, but I don't like it. And there are programs, absolutely, that will help support older kids and all the way through adulthood. Absolutely. I've had many times moms will say, "Can you help my husband?" And it's kind of amazing how working with their child may uncover and change some of the habits of the family members too.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, Julie, do you have any other questions?
I think we covered a lot of really
Browning? Yeah, it was really helpful.
I mean, like Judy said, we could do this all after. There's so much, but I think this is a great place to start.
Yeah, it was great. I learned a ton in this. It was very informative. So I really appreciate your time and thank you. I'll put all the resources and stuff in the show notes and the descriptor and all of that to help listeners kind of go off on their journey.
Perfect. And that website that I was mentioning is called feedingmatters.org. I think it's great. It's a national website that you can find anyone by zip code, and it's
Yeah, that's great. Is that global or just in the United States?
well, I think it's just in the United
Yeah,
States,
that's
but
fine.
many times, we have so many social media ways of connecting with other therapists in other countries. Sometimes, you could find somebody
Yeah.
if you find somebody. Yeah, reach out to me. Oh, Julie, better yet.
I do think that oftentimes parents struggle with like, oh my gosh, what am I going to pack my kid for lunch? And that's what her recent book, the Feeding the Littles Lunch book, is about, and it's great. It has so many good ideas.
Oh, thanks, Julie. And what's really fun about books like that is when you look at it, I've had parents just give kids Post-it notes and they'll just say, I want this, I want this. And parents are like, I didn't know you would eat that. What are you talking about? And it's not all cutesy stuff. It's not like, oh, make a smiley face on the sandwich and they're going to eat it. These are just real lunches. These are like, I got 2 minutes and you're going to pack a lunch. So just
Oh, that's a great resource.
it's fun.
Show Kate just a few of the pictures real quick.
No, I have to turn around you, Kate.
Okay, that's okay.
I'm like, I could go get mine off the table, but yours is right behind you, Judy. So.
And it totally plays into your idea of empowering your child by just having them point.
Yeah.
Yeah, the bento box.
Yeah. And every one of them is it's kind of hard to hold it up and show, but just, ideas, and this one, you can see them.
Yeah, it's so
It has kiwi, and it just gives kids like the ideas of like, oh, what's that food called? What's that fruit? We've never had that one before. And it helps parents just to trigger, oh, we need to get those again.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. Thank you. It was
Thank you. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Enjoy the Super Bowl. Thank you for doing this on a Sunday. And Julie, thank you so much for making this happen.
Julie.
Yeah, I know. Thanks for doing it on a Sunday. I was like, let's just do it because that other time we had started to get really full and I was starting to feel a little overwhelmed.
It's great.
The timing was just perfect. Thanks.
It worked out great.
Does you need anything else?
Okay.
Bye, Julie. Bye, Jules.